Endless Energy, a blueprint for productivity, focus, and self-discipline for the perpetually tired and lazy. Written by Peter Hollins, narrated by Russell Newton. So the previous chapter takes care of the various ways in which our precious life energy could be faltering or sputtering out in a physical sense. Of course, you may have experienced depleted energy levels, even though all the physical boxes seem to be ticked. You could be doing everything right and still feel like your life force is sapped from you. Why? Remember the energy pyramid? Everything is interrelated. Emotional and mental energy vampires are in some ways worse than their physical counterparts because they're harder to spot and combat. They're ephemeral, and there's no obvious formula of input to output that can fix them. More effort will not equate into a proportionate improvement in energy. No, there's often a root cause that must be addressed, or all your other efforts will be in vain. It's obvious that you'll be tired if you don't sleep well, but it may not be so obvious that you'll feel utterly exhausted if you've been arguing all morning with a loved one, stressed about money, or just carrying around a vague sense of anxiety about life in general. And sometimes these emotional and mental vampires simply have to run their course, such as waiting for the will to live to return after a painful breakup or divorce. In fact, many constantly fatigued problems come down not to physical issues but rather to emotional and psychological ones, although they can often intertwine and enter into a chicken or egg cycle. In the same way a bacteria or virus can weaken your physical body, an emotional virus can slow you down too, leaving you feeling depressed, tired, and pessimistic. The mind is more powerful than the body, and it doesn't allow you to forget it. Consider the phenomenon of psychosomatic illness and people convincing themselves into feeling poorly, or those who go completely catatonic overnight because of some unbearably shocking news. Thoughts and emotions can make themselves known in heavy limbs, sluggishness, and feeling as though our life force has been zapped. Have you ever noticed how prone you are to colds and flus when you're stressed, or what worry does to your stomach? Have you noticed how you feel light and healthy around some people and utterly drained around others, as though interacting with them literally sucked the energy out of you? To add to the matter, many emotional energy vampires are unconscious. The fact that they are manifesting physically is precisely because your conscious mind has not quite figured out a way to acknowledge them. If you have no idea that this is even a problem, you may keep on swallowing supplements and eating your broccoli and diligently getting your 8 hours each night, and it won't matter one bit if the thing that's making you tired is a deep dread about your work or the strain of facing an unpleasant truth. How you feel about yourself and your place in the world, your deep underlying assumptions about it all, these are all simmering quietly below the surface. If you spent every moment of your life with the unconscious belief, I'm a failure and I'll never amount to anything, isn't it much the same thing as trying to live with a chronic, low-grade illness? The self-defeating mind. Emotional energy all starts with the way we view the world and our place in it. Unfortunately, our perception of the world is 99% incorrect. There's no other way around it. What we see is often not the reality that exists, and that's completely normal. This is because of the various biases and perspectives we bring from our past. Some are good, most are negative, and the reason we even need to talk about this issue. They are one of the ultimate energy vampires because they shed light on our insecurities and rob us of our confidence and power. We spend so much time worrying and anxious that it leaves us too exhausted to do much else. Anytime your brain is in a state of even mild distress, there's energy being discharged for self-protection. To stop emotional vampires, you must change the way you view the world. Information and events come to us in a neutral state. It's only through our interpretation that these items have positive or negative connotations. How we choose to view events determines our realities and has the ability to completely undermine our confidence and will to persevere. More than likely, you're suffering from frequent cognitive distortions, a view of reality that is negative, pessimistic, and generally incorrect. It can damage your self-esteem, lower your confidence, and make you feel as if you have no control over your life. Cognitive distortion is also a form of self-talk that is damaging and can become so ingrained and habit-forming that people don't realize they're creating an alternate reality where they're destined for unhappiness and a lack of confidence. Most of us have enough trouble coping with reality. Distorting our view of the world to be more menacing and difficult just saps our confidence and will unnecessarily. Enter Craig. While returning from the restroom, Craig walked past a closed-door meeting in his supervisor Max's office. As he passed by the glass door, he noticed that almost all his coworkers were in the room, and many glanced in his direction. He immediately began to feel nervous. Were they talking about him? Had he done something wrong? He was probably going to be fired. Last week, he'd noticed Sheila and Katie giggling and looking at him in the break room, and the Nickerby account had just moved to another company. He was probably going to get fired, and it'd be impossible to find another job, because he would definitely be getting a horrible recommendation. He wouldn't be able to make his truck payment next month without a job. It would probably get repossessed. Craig was in a downward spiral for the rest of the day, worrying about his future work prospects and how he would survive without his usual income while looking for a new job. He fretted, worried, and agonized for hours with friends over the phone, which only left him exhausted and stressed, and not one step closer to any type of solution. The next day was Craig's birthday, and he was feeling very depressed. He dragged himself into work, prepared for the worst. He felt it'd be fitting to be fired on his birthday, only the fourth worst birthday he would have, and braced for impact. As soon as he sat down at his desk, he heard a loud, "Surprise! Happy birthday, Craig!" All his coworkers were gathered behind his desk, armed with small gifts. Sheila rushed over and blurted out, "We've been planning this surprise for weeks. We thought we'd been caught when you walked past Max's office yesterday, but it looks like we really surprised you." Craig was thankful and relieved, but the damage to his energy was already done, and his self-inflicted wounds were all for nothing. Craig was suffering from severe cognitive distortion. His perception of an event, a meeting of many of his coworkers, was colored by his negative, draining viewpoint. All his coworkers were ultimately planning a surprise birthday party. Craig jumped to conclusions and assumed the worst. This cognitive distortion served to lower Craig's self-esteem and put him into a panic mode in which he wasted his time and energy worrying about an unlikely future scenario. Imagine being at the mercy of these types of distortions and the impact it would have on your energy. The first step to launching a counterattack on these negative thoughts is by noticing when you're having them. Then, you must make a conscious effort to turn them off or find alternative explanations for your worries. By refuting or shutting off this negative thinking over and over again, the damaging thoughts will diminish over time and automatically be replaced by more rational, balanced thinking. It's only through constant vigilance that you can replace the bad habit of cognitive distortion with the good habit of positive thinking. Many of us may notice this type of internal dialogue while at work, but aren't able to recognize that it's something that is disengaging us from reality. Thus, I'll cover a few of the most common cognitive distortions, illustrate them with examples, and discuss how they're detrimental to emotional stability and, thus, energy. All or nothing thinking. Gosh, I haven't read a single book this month, and my goal was to read 3. I'm horrible at sticking to goals. If I can't read 3 books, I may as well not read at all. I chewed with my mouth open at one time. How could I have done that? How disgusting. No one will ever be with someone like me. Tasha's going to break up with me tomorrow. I just know it. All or nothing thinking can also be called tunnel vision. This type of cognitive distortion occurs when you focus only on one outcome or factor to judge an entire situation, and anything else amounts to a failure. Instead of taking a balanced viewpoint, there is only black or white, yes or no, fail or succeed. As fictional race car driver Ricky Bobby in Talladega Nights said, "If you ain't first, you're last." Obviously, this is not true, but that's the stark contrast that this cognitive distortion creates, and it sets you up to feel lousy because failure is the most likely scenario. Not reaching your goal doesn't immediately signal the end of your world as you know it, and consequences that seem enormous and irreversible rarely are. All or nothing thinking also manifests itself through lists of ironclad rules about behavior or expectations. People who break these rules make us feel angry, and in turn, if we break a rule, we feel guilty. Lists of shoulds or musts, such as, "I must go to the gym every day," or "I must arrive at work at least 15 minutes before my shift begins," might sound motivational, but they leave little room for compromise or adjustment if life events get in the way of your plan. All of these tendencies create a set of expectations that you are destined to fall short of, and when this happens on a continual basis, you can't help but feel inadequate and mediocre at best. To overcome the cognitive distortion of all or nothing thinking, you must challenge yourself to see the middle ground. Personalizing. Why can't our daughter Marcia hold down a job? She's constantly moving from company to company. I think she was even fired from this last position. I must have done something wrong as a parent. If only we had sent her to Laurelswood High School instead of the public school, this never would have happened. It's all my fault. I should have quit my job and just been there for her. I feel terrible that Patricia overcooked the pot roast. If only Jeremy and I hadn't been 30 minutes late for the dinner party. If only I'd told him to hurry, this wouldn't have happened. I take full responsibility for this. I should have cooked everything myself. Personalization is the mother of guilt. In the cognitive distortion of taking everything personally, you feel responsible for events that cannot conceivably be your fault. While it is admirable to take responsibility for your actions, some things are completely out of your control. The subway schedule, other people's actions, and a million day-to-day factors. While engaging in personalizing, you might believe that everything others say or do is a direct personal reaction to you, even when logically this doesn't fit. It's pretty difficult to feel good about yourself if you believe you're responsible for all the ills of the world around you. To be confident, you have to be able to focus on yourself, not on the perceived reactions of others. The opposite of personalizing is externalizing. It's another important cognitive distortion to note. When caught in this trap, individuals refuse to blame themselves for anything. Instead, they blame everyone and everything else. The world is out to get them and only them. These individuals blame others for holding them back, causing them pain or sadness, and even point to other people as the cause of life troubles. All of this blame is given without any recognition for the part the individual played in his or her own troubles, pain, or sadness. Neither of these types of thinking are healthy, and they both force you to expend a considerable amount of emotional energy jumping through hoops and agonizing over everyday issues. In order to escape from both of these cognitive distortions, question what part you actually played in the event, and consider options in which you're not entirely to blame. Overgeneralization. I'm never going to find a girlfriend because my last date went so terribly. I'm destined to be single forever. He'll never be on time. He was late for both our previous meetings. He's a lost cause. I'm not going to meet with him again. In the trap of overgeneralization, you take one small negative experience and assume all similar future experiences will be negative. Overgeneralization is unrepresentative of reality because you're operating on minimal experience, information, and evidence. You're jumping to conclusions and constructing a world that doesn't exist in reality. It's truly an exercise in imagination, a classic sneaky energy drainer. Common cues of overgeneralization are always and never. When starting a sentence or a thought with always or never, consider whether you have the experience or evidence to back up the statement. Do you have the ability to look past your current feelings or the most recent event that's causing you to feel this way? The very nature of emotions is to overwhelm and cloud judgment. Perhaps you're merely honoring your emotions instead of seeking a balanced view. To overcome the trap of overgeneralization, take time to question whether evidence may exist showing that future events could be different. Consider just how little information you have. Has every event of this type in your life ended in exactly the same way? Or are there more than a few outliers? Do all of your friends have the exact same story? Or have some of them had different experiences? Catastrophizing. Lacey is out late again. I just know that she's cheating on me. We're never going to last as a couple. We have to be heading for divorce. I need to call a lawyer right now. Why haven't I received a letter from the University of California yet? They must be rejecting me. I can't believe it. I'm not going to get into any universities. What am I going to do? I guess I need to start learning how to become a plumber. When you engage in catastrophizing, you immediately jump to the worst-case scenario and lose hope because the event seems so imminent. Catastrophizing can cause you to become stressed and anxious. Even the smallest actions can have enormous consequences. How stable and energetic can you really be if every day you appear to be facing your own personal version of the apocalypse? As with other cognitive distortions, a degree of introspection and thinking about your thoughts is necessary. Slow down and question whether things are truly as bad as you're making them seem. Are your assumptions even realistic? Consider alternative explanations and past experiences in similar situations. Ask yourself, in past similar situations, what did I do, and how did the event turn out? How would an innocent bystander explain the situation? What am I fixating on, and why? Jumping to conclusions. Why didn't David smile back at me this morning? He must think the project proposal I sent him yesterday afternoon is stupid. There's no point in even going to the gym. I'm never going to reach my goal of running that 10K with Candace. Jumping to conclusions occurs when you make an irrational assumption about people or circumstances based on personal opinion and feeling. It begins with feelings of inadequacy or insecurity, which influence the way you perceive events and statements. When you observe something that supports your worst fears, you take it as a confirmation of everything you secretly knew to be terrible and true. Just like with other cognitive distortions, it causes you to fall down a rabbit hole of negativity until you end up at the worst possible conclusion. There are two categories within the cognitive distortion of jumping to conclusions: mind reading and fortune telling. While engaging in mind reading, you assume you know what someone else is thinking. It's impossible to know exactly what someone else is thinking, yet with this cognitive distortion, people make decisions based on the imagined thoughts of other people. And, of course, you assume people are always thinking the worst about you. Fortune-telling involves predicting negative future events without evidence. When engaging in fortune-telling, you predict only negative outcomes for the future and have no real basis for doing so. Fortune-telling makes any semblance of optimism impossible. Emotional reasoning. I can't afford to pay all of my bills again this month. I feel hopeless and depressed. There's no solution to my problems. Oh my gosh, why did I bring up that movie? It's 10 years old. Everyone will think I'm so out of touch. I'm such a bore at all these parties. Engaging in the cognitive distortion of emotional reasoning means that you're taking your emotions as evidence. Whatever you feel right now is whatever reality you find yourself in. That's a difficult way to live. While engaging in this behavior, observed evidence is discarded in favor of the truth of your feelings about the event. Humans tend to believe that how they feel must automatically be true. If you feel stupid and boring, then you must actually be stupid, and boring. This is commonly referenced by the phrase, "I feel it, therefore it must be true." Emotional reasoning is one of the most dangerous of the cognitive distortions because it can be so wildly different from reality, and in the span of minutes can change. Is reality actually shifting moment by moment? Of course not. Only your emotions are changing that quickly. Being conscious of and allowing yourself to feel your emotions is important to maintaining your emotional health and energy. However, that does not mean you should take your emotions to heart as a true expression of reality. In fact, your emotions often have very little to do with the status quo of reality. Remember, reality is neutral. Your emotions cause you to perceive reality as either positive or negative. To escape the trap of emotional reasoning and take control of this automatic response, question whether your emotional state of mind is preventing you from viewing events clearly. Ask yourself what the objective bystander interpretation would be. Compare it to your emotional response and try to mediate the difference. Just like you wouldn't go grocery shopping when hungry, you shouldn't evaluate anything when emotional. Always take time to return to a calm state before making decisions or committing yourself to a specific course of action. Viewing a situation while emotional or with emotional reasoning is like watching a completely neutral scene with horror music being played over it, and then joyous music, and then the next minute, music fitting for a clown's entrance. You won't know what's really happening in front of your face because the music will influence you a certain way. Damaging comparisons. Finally, although not a true cognitive distortion, viewing life through comparisons with others has the same tendency to create a negative reality while wasting an unhealthy amount of energy on something you cannot change. Regardless of whatever strengths and qualities you bring to the table, you'll become miserable when you compare yourself to others. We have a tendency to compare ourselves to other people around us or to some kind of imagined ideal, and neither of these situations is good. Comparing is a learned habit that destroys your confidence because it tries to put all your value and worth into one tiny aspect. You have to understand that you are a compilation of many different traits and talents. You have your appearance, your earning ability, your ability to play sports, how fast you type, and so on. These all matter. Unfortunately, when we measure ourselves against others, we ignore or throw out all the things we're good at and only focus on the one thing we're not good at or that we imagine others excel at. The problem with comparing in a social setting is that we often carry with us a fictionalized ideal of how a perfect person would get along in particular social situations. This person is about as real as Superman. Unfortunately, we treat that notion as if it's absolutely real, and we allow ourselves to feel crappy and inferior when we don't measure up. When we compare ourselves to this imagined ideal, we fail to see our strengths, values, and worth. When you compare, you only see what's on the outside, what people allow others to see about them. But what you're viewing isn't the whole picture, and it's not necessarily who these other people really are. It's just their very best versions of themselves, the one they're willing to present to the world. You end up degrading yourself by choosing your darkest and worst view of yourself to compare. Other people aren't only what they show to the world. Most people put on a good show. You probably know that a couple appears to get along great and be very much in love. They seem totally happy, and it's as if they truly connect with each other in an enviable way. But do you really know what might be going on in their private life? Hopefully, you can understand that these distortions are not only falsehoods, but enormous wastes of our mental and emotional energy. The more time we spend in our own heads agonizing about the possibilities of our internal world, the less energy we can expend toward the external world. Challenging beliefs. Unfortunately, these cognitive distortions reflect our core beliefs, and are part of our personal psychological networks. They're instilled at an early age and reinforced by our experiences. Many of us have been trained to waste emotional energy catering to these distortions. That's why they're hard to nail down. They are how you view the world and don't require conscious effort. And yet, we still feel their effects on us through triggering events and emotional distress. An ungodly amount of energy is squandered here. Challenging and changing distortions from an analytical perspective is what is known as cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT for short. The main strategy of CBT is to teach people how to deal with their negative core beliefs head on and reprogram them into something less harmful. There are two primary methods for intervention in the cycle of low confidence. The first is cognitive restructuring, a technique for identifying negative cognitive patterns and untrue assumptions we make about ourselves and altering them. Cognitive restructuring is a treatment intended to show people why they are stuck in these negative feedback loops and what they can do to significantly alter their thought and behavior patterns in order to remove themselves from the vicious cycle. By recognizing a negative thought pattern and understanding why it persists, we can react differently to it and steer ourselves in a positive direction. How does one build their awareness about their counterproductive thoughts, emotions, and behaviors? Generally, the first step of those methods entails identifying subconscious thoughts, the ones providing us with a continuous commentary on our experiences as we're living them. These thoughts are constantly affecting our moods because we tend to simply accept them as accurate reflections of reality and ourselves. When we stop accepting the narrative being written by our subconscious, we're able to consider alternative points of view. Suddenly the cycle is broken, or at least altered. This shift leads to a more sensible and stable way of thinking about whatever is causing us distress at any given time, preventing us from falling into those vicious cycles mentioned earlier. By simply understanding alternative possibilities, we can balance out our emotions and thoughts and reduce the sadness and hopelessness that occurs when we get trapped in a negative feedback loop. This in turn enables us to engage in behaviors and activities which promote our well-being, pulling us out of our dark mindset and making us stronger and better. Few people are actively aware of their thinking patterns, even though they engage in these patterns every day. CBT allows you to address errors in your thinking to correct your behavior and, in turn, change your life. You might assume that you require a therapist, or at least an incredibly patient friend to conduct CBT, but that's where thought diaries and worksheets come into play. The concept of the thought diary was born from the desire to identify the core beliefs that inform our actions and emotions. It uncovers the relationships between our behavior, thoughts, and feelings. Basically, it's the process of cognitive behavioral therapy, and similar to how a counselor might help one get to the root of their psychological issues. A typical entry in a thought diary outlines a triggering event or thought, the self-messaging that comes from it, and the resultant emotions that emerge. Sifting through all this information brings up your core beliefs so you can challenge them. Remember, we want to try to isolate and analyze the automatic thoughts we have and replace them with healthier versions. Steps in a thought diary entry can be arranged in the easy-to-remember ABC format, although for the purposes of this process it's actually ACB. Activating event. This is simply the origin point of your emotional change. It could be an actual physical event, but it could also be an internal event, a thought, memory, or mental image. It's whatever caused your emotional status to change from calm to agitation. Hearing an old song that reminds you of someone you were close to. Running into an old friend on the street. Being criticized by a supervisor. Remembering being bullied by a high school classmate. Consequences. In this step, you identify the specific emotions and sensations that arose. Start with the most basic of emotions: sad, glad, mad, and scared, and then branch out. These could be simple feeling words: anxious, unhappy, sickened, panicky, melancholy, confused, and so forth. To get more specific about the emotions involved, you may want to rate how intensely you felt them on whatever scale works for you. Maybe you were 65% panicky and 35% confused. Your feelings of sickness may have been a 10, and your anxiety may have been a 5. Underline or circle which emotion was most relevant. Beliefs. This is where the action begins. How do you link the activating event with the consequences? What unconscious narrative or story did you tell yourself to achieve the consequence? What leaps in logic or to conclusions did you make to arrive at your current negative state? Getting to the bottom of these beliefs involves some drilling of yourself with progressive questioning until you finally get to the root of your situation, your core beliefs. What was I thinking? What was going through my head when this happened? What's wrong with that? What does this all mean? What does it reveal about me? Yes, it's a lot of work, and you might struggle at points to obtain the answers you're looking for. But the effort to peel away layers of self-messaging will eventually pay off. When your investigation finally brings you face to face with your core beliefs, that's when you can start the process of challenging them. Let's take an example of seemingly benign activating events and put them through the ABC ringer. They may seem a bit abbreviated, but you'll find that they closely mirror real-life situations. 1. Steve is having a conversation with his new friend Emily at a table at a bar. They're having a good talk until Steve's acquaintance Jack walks up, pulls up a chair and starts chatting, oblivious to the fact that he stopped Steve and Emily's conversation cold. Steve is angry. You won't like him when he's angry. Steve's activating event is Jack stopping his conversation. That's easy. What is the consequence? What did this event activate feelings-wise? Steve felt flustered, for one. That was probably the dominant emotion. He'd give it an 8 on a scale of 1 to 10. He also sensed anger and frustration, but not quite as powerfully as the panic, maybe a 4. He felt the front of his head get a little heavy. Steve qualifies this as confusion, but he's not sure why, so he gives this a 3. Now Steve has to figure out why this particular event made him freak out. What is the connection from the action to the consequential emotional state? Does he dislike Jack? No, not at all, he decides. He's an okay guy, if sometimes a little overexcitable. So, Steve asks himself, what was going through his head at the time? He was having a good conversation with Emily, feeling like they were both talking earnestly and actively about shared interests. And then it got interrupted. He felt flustered. Why? Because he was disappointed that the conversation was derailed and that Jack wasn't self-aware enough to know he was interrupting. What does that mean? He feels that Jack was being careless about his ego and personality and thought nothing of imposing his will over Steve's. Why is that? Because Steve doesn't think he asserts himself enough. And why is that? Because Steve believes he's too modest to ever be able to speak up for himself. And what does that mean? Steve doesn't feel he deserves respect, and Jack's interruption was just a reminder that he isn't worthy of it. That's Steve's core belief. He has little, if any, self-regard, and thinks he lets people take advantage of his recessive nature to bowl him over and take over in social situations without regard to what he really wants. Because of that, he doesn't see himself as somebody respectable. It's not easy to reach this point just from analyzing a reaction to an interruption, but doing so is how you come to understand and change your core beliefs. Challenging beliefs does have the temporary effect of requiring even more of your emotional and mental energy, but this will ultimately decrease the ways in which your brain runs itself in exhausting circles. This has been Endless Energy, a blueprint for productivity, focus, and self-discipline for the perpetually tired and lazy. Written by Peter Hollins, narrated by Russell Newton. Copyright 2019 by Peter Hollins. Production copyright by Peter Hollins.